of the year Tuesday seminar. We were going to start next week, but we decided to speed up and do this additional panel because of the of how important the Venezuelan election and outcome is. And we are really, really thrilled and honored to have three of the smartest analysts of Venezuelan politics that I know, who I'll introduce in a second. It's a combined in-person and Zoom event. One speaker will be in-house and two via Zoom. But basically we want to get at, or the questions that I'm most interested in from this discussion are, first of all, was this outcome inevitable? In retrospect, was a transition ever possible? Or was it an illusion to begin with? And if it was possible, what would have had to happen to make a transition happen? Another question I'm interested in, and you know, speakers are not obligated to answer, but just how badly weakened is the regime? Has the regime been badly weakened or not by this crisis? And finally, what are the options that are open to the various actors where we stand now? What are the options that are open to the opposition? What are the options that are open, let's say, to the Brazilian government? What are the options that are open to the US government? So those are the questions that I'm hoping that we'll address. Let me introduce our three speakers and then we'll go in that order, and they'll speak for 12 to 14 minutes each, which should leave us time for discussion. Our first speaker is with us. Dorothy Kronick is assistant professor of public policy at the Goldman School at UC Berkeley. Before that, she taught at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a political scientist who's trained at Stanford University and specializes in, among other things, the politics of crime and policing in Latin America. She has already, despite being in an early stage in her career, published in just about all of the top journals in political science. And she's also very quickly emerged as one of the most thoughtful and insightful thinkers on Venezuelan politics. So we're really thrilled to have you with us today. Our second speaker, going in alphabetical order, is my former student, Roberto Patiño. He is not only one of the smartest, but one of the bravest opposition activists and figures that I know. He emerged politically out of the student movement about 15 years ago in Venezuela. He came to HKS and got a degree at the Kennedy School, which is where I had the good fortune of meeting him. He then went back to Venezuela and founded Convive and Alimenta la Solidaridad, which are two of Venezuela's largest community organizing initiatives. He also co-founded and currently directs Instituto 2000, which is a think tank that focuses on global issues such as migration and food security, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Roberto maybe will tell us a little bit of what he's doing, but he's a longtime activist and leader in the political party Primera Justicia. Roberto, it's great to have you here. Thank you. And finally, David Smilde is known to, I bet all of you. He is, let me get this right, Charles and Leo Favrot Professor of Human Relations and Chair of the Sociology Department at Tulane University. His research varies widely, focused on culture, violence, political conflict, peace building, and human rights, but is also widely known as one of the leading voices in the United States on Venezuelan politics, especially in the Chavez and Maduro eras. He's written several books on Latin America, a couple books on Venezuela, including Venezuela's Bolivarian democracy, politics, development, and culture in Venezuela under Chavez, that was published a little over a decade ago. And then more recently, The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Development, Crime, and Politics During Chavismo. Thank you, David, for joining us. I know you are very busy. So we start with Dorothy. We'll give you 12, 14 minutes, and floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So the question that Steve and Alicia originally posed to this panel is, what happened? What happened in Venezuela on July 28th? And my answer is opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez won a landslide victory against incumbent Nicolas Maduro, and then used Maduro's own voting technology to prove it. So in other words, what happened is something extraordinary and something extraordinarily rare, right? Because we can think of other examples of opposition candidates winning elections in undemocratic regimes, but not so much of using the government's own technology to publicly debunk the government's claim of victory. And so what I'm going to talk about is, how is this possible? How is it physically possible that the government's own voting machines provided the Gonzalez campaign proof of their victory? And also, how is it politically possible that a competitive authoritarian regime under Hugo Chavez chose to install this technology in the first place, and a less competitive, more authoritarian government, Maduro, chose not only to keep this technology in place, but to strengthen it and make it even more transparent? Okay, so I'm gonna take a couple minutes on this first question. How is it physically possible that the government's voting technology provided the Gonzalez campaign proof of their victory? And I think that these details are relevant not only to this question of what happened on July 28th, but also to anyone thinking about electoral administration anywhere in the world, including especially here in the United States with our election coming up. So Venezuela has electronic voting, and you go cast your vote on, it's a touch screen, picture kind of a mid-2000s iMac. Okay, you make your choice, and then the machine prints out a receipt, a paper ticket that says your choice. So maybe it says Maduro, PSUV, the government party, Maduro, Partido Comunista, or most statistically likely in this election, El Mundo Gonzalez, MUD. And then you deposit that paper receipt in a physical ballot box. And then at the end of the day, each voting machine prints out a long tally sheet. These are the actas that you've heard so much about since this election. And there's one copy of each of these tally sheets, not only for Edmundo Gonzalez's witness, but also for Maduro's witnesses, and also for the poll workers who are manning each voting machine, each voting booth. And here I think this is really important. Poll workers in Venezuela are not volunteers. Okay, they're randomly selected from among the voters registered at each voting machine, and they're required to serve as in jury duty from the United States. Okay, so what did the Gonzalez campaign do? They first organized a huge team to collect and scan these long paper tally sheets. They built an app to organize the data from the tally sheets into a spreadsheet. They put up a website on which they published both the images of 25,000 of these paper tally sheets and also a spreadsheet containing the data, and that was up within 2 days of the election. And if you believe these data, as I now do, then they indicate that Gonzalez won with, say, 66% of the vote nationwide to Maduro's 31%, 32%. Okay. Now, it may be the case that few people in this room today doubt that fact, right? We kind of all know that at this point. But I want to take you back to the week of the election, because I think at that moment, many people were wondering what to believe. And many people in the influential governments that Steve mentioned at the outset were wondering what to believe. We're wondering, are these data on the Gonzalez campaign website real, or are they somehow fabricated? Because of course, in theory, the Gonzalez campaign could have, say, a set of fake tally sheets or used AI to generate fake images of tally sheets. Or, even if the tally sheets themselves are real, in theory, the campaign could have somehow hacked or pre-programmed the voting machines to print tally sheets that don't reflect votes cast. There's a decades-old expression in Venezuela since before Chavez, acta mata voto, right? And so that, could have happened. And I think in that moment, those ideas were somewhat plausible, because if you believe these data, then the magnitude of Gonzalez's victory is shocking. If you believe these data, then Gonzalez got 8.5 million votes nationwide, which is likely more votes than Hugo Chavez got in the 2012 presidential election, when the government had tons of money to spend in the run up to the campaign and before 5 or 8 million Venezuelans left the country. And so I think it's reasonable that a lot of people didn't know what to believe. Now, when I saw these data, my first instinct was to do some sort of quantitative forensic analysis, like look at the last digits of the vote, that type of thing. But then, a colleague, Yuri Simonson, who does a lot of forensic analysis along those lines, pointed out that actually it's not necessary because the paper trail, paper tickets that each voter gets, and the paper actas contain in and of themselves proof of the validity of these data. Okay, so we might ask, are these paper tally sheets posted on the campaign website the same ones that were printed by the machines on election day, or are they somehow fake? And here I think is the key point about that. Venezuelan electoral law allows not only Gonzalez's witness, but also Maduro's witnesses and the poll workers to retain copies of those tally sheets. So what that means is that there are thousands of people across the country with copies of those tally sheets folded up in their wallet, rolled up in a drawer, pinned on the fridge. And to the best of my knowledge, not a single credible claim has emerged of someone having a copy of a tally sheet that doesn't match the ones posted on the campaign website. Okay, now there's a second possibility, which is even if those tally sheets are the ones printed on election day, maybe the campaign somehow colluded with or hacked these voting machines to print tally sheets that don't correspond to votes passed acta mata voto. And I will say two things about this. One, that possibility strikes me as implausible ex ante. The idea that the campaign could have had access to machines provided by Xplay, a vendor selected and vetted by the Venezuelan government, strikes me as implausible. But many people and influential people start from the premise you can't underestimate these people, right? And even if that's your starting point, the Venezuelan process provides proof that that did not happen, because at the close of voting, a large sample of those ballot boxes are opened, and the individual paper tickets, Steve's vote, Alicia's vote, Yanilda's vote, are counted in the presence of the opposition witnesses and the poll workers. And that hand count of paper ballots matches the tally sheets, the actas that the opposition campaign published. Okay, so there's a Venezuelan journalist who wrote years ago that Venezuela's electronic voting system is just the world's most expensive pencil because it prints paper ballots that are counted by hand. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Acta mata fraude, because the count of those paper tickets matches the tally sheets published online by the Gonzalez campaign. And that really is the magic of this system, that you do not have to trust Edmundo Gonzalez or Maria Corina Machado or the voting machine vendor or the Venezuelan government or anyone else in order to see that these data are real. Just as in the past, in past elections in Venezuela, you didn't have to trust Chavez or Maduro or the Venezuelan Electoral Council in order to see that the results announced by the government were in fact the true results. So this brings me to my second question of why would a competitive authoritarian regime install such a transparent system? And then why would Maduro maintain it and even strengthen it? And I think the history here is really illuminating. So Chavez, Maduro's predecessor, chose this system in 2004 in advance of the recall referendum, in which voters were going to choose whether to recall Chavez or allow him to complete his term. And at that time, Chavez had a majority. Oil prices had already started to rise, and this was the beginning of what would then become the biggest fiscal windfall in recorded Latin American history. So Chavez's challenge at that moment was not to set up a system that would allow him to stealthily doctor the tallies, but rather a system that would allow him to defend the real tallies against false accusations of fraud. And this system did exactly that time and time again. Opposition leaders cried fraud, and the government said, just as the Gonzalez campaign is saying now, but look, the spreadsheet matches the actas, the tally sheets matches the hand count of paper ballots. And so that's it. And so this system for years worked to convince the world, including very skeptical observers, that Chavez and Chavismo actually had a majority, just as it is now convincing the world of the reality of a large anti-Maduro majority. Okay. Think, why would Maduro allow this system to remain in place and even add features that made it even more transparent? I think the key thing here is Maduro thought that he would win this. It's very likely Maduro thought he would win this election. Why? One possible explanation is this is just a massive miscalculation and we need like an edited volume bringing stupidity back in. And, but I actually don't think that's the right way to think about it. So in the 2021 regional election, PSUV, the government party, got more votes than the Mood candidates, and almost as many votes as all other parties combined. And since then, the economy has only improved somewhat. The government's ability to bus people to the polls, intimidate voters, etc., has not deteriorated. The government barred Maria Corina Machado from running. They prevented Corina Yoris from registering as a candidate. And I think, it's true that public opinion polls predicted a massive Gonzalez victory, but as economist Francisco Rodriguez pointed out in advance of the election, those same polls had over-predicted opposition performance in many recent elections, which is all to say, if Maduro 4 months ago, was thinking, we're going to eke out an actual victory, I think that was not unreasonable. And if that were the case, then exactly what you would want to do would be to maximize the transparency of the system in order to maximize the legitimizing benefits of this election. Okay, I think I have 1 minute left. So let me try to turn for a minute to these larger questions of what does this mean now, 6-7 weeks out, there hasn't been a transition. And I want to say 2 things about this. So one, Steve began just now by asking, was a transition ever possible? And I think this is the debate that I've seen over the last 6 weeks, with some people saying, this regime is just something about Maduro and these individuals' characters, that they're incapable of negotiating. It's not a rational calculation, it's something intrinsic, that a transition would never have been possible. And other people saying, well, no, of course they're making a rational calculation about whether they're better off holding on to power or leaving power or power sharing. And the problem is that the off-ramp is not attractive enough. The problem is that whatever promises the Biden administration might make, they can't promise for a potential Trump administration, and the ICC is out there, et cetera. I mean, it's hard to say. I am in the second camp, right? And so then the question is, well, how could opposition leaders, the US government, the Brazilian government, the Colombian government change that calculus and that balance? And what I really want to say about that is, thank goodness it's time for me to turn it over to David.
I was waiting for your key.
But Roberto's up next.
Thank you, Dorothy. And thank you, Steve, for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's an honor. And I have to say that during my time at the Kennedy School, these seminars that already existed were among my favorite times of the week. So I'm happy to see them still ongoing. So I'll start by saying that for me, what happened on July 28 is a turning point. It's a watershed moment in Venezuelan politics. And I appreciate that Dorothy made that very detailed and precise explanation of how the electoral system works, because it allows me to highlight how I think one of the key elements of the Chavista narrative on which they based their populist movement that was destroying progressively institutions the cornerstone of that was that they had the support of the Venezuelan people. So Chavismo, in a way, has been a pioneer in a lot of the techniques that we've seen populists use around the world. Not only banning candidates or even stealing opposition symbols, but closing the media environment, repressing the opposition, and trying to discourage people from that oppose them from actually voting. No, so when we see what goes on in Turkey, in Russia, there are similarities, and I think Chavismo, in a way, it pioneered a lot of these mechanisms. So for me, the evidence that this was going to happen was becoming evident early last year in my grassroots work in Venezuela, and specifically in Caracas. I have seen how a lot of even the Chavista base were fed up with Maduro, not only because they were not capable of really delivering an economic system that gave opportunities for the people, but also because we had massive corruption scandals that were becoming more visible for everyone to see. And even the regime recognized that Tarek El Aissami, one of Maduro's closest collaborators, had stolen billions of dollars. So I think this was already upsetting people a lot, and people could see how regime officials were living very opulent lives while the people of Venezuela were struggling a lot. So I remember that last year, a lot of people within the opposition, one of the tasks we had back then was to convince people, not only in Venezuela, but abroad, that we could actually win this election. A lot of people were making calculations and saying, oh, this is going to be the same. The playing field is so uneven that it's not going to be possible. And for me, the key element was that the opposition was capable of unifying around the primaries, not only on one leadership, but also one strategy, the strategy of participating in the election, despite all the imbalances during the process. So from my perspective, it's a turning point because when you think about authoritarian systems or in Latin America, and people like to compare Venezuela and say, well, change is not possible. Look at Cuba, look at Nicaragua, and so on. My answer to that is that those regimes haven't had a July 28th, right? They haven't had a moment on which they made the mistake of allowing the people to express in such a massive way and have proof of what really happened. So I think that's why we are entering a complete new era in Venezuela. I don't think that the debates around how to change the political system will be the same after what happened in July 28. In terms of the consequences of this election, of course, on the, let's say, negative side, we've seen brutal repression, over 1,500 people who've been detained, over a couple dozen who've been killed in demonstrations. And what I think really generates more interest from the international community is the phenomenon of migration. So Venezuela right now, Venezuelans have been forced to migrate. In some accounts, the number is 7 million, others say 8 million. But I've seen and conducted actually polls that show that a lot of people were expecting within Venezuela that the election would deliver change. And if there's no hope for political change, migration will actually get worse. And that's a destabilizing factor for the region. So I think that's a very important element of the discussion because countries such as China have been trying to, in forums such as the UN, have been saying that they don't want to allow for any discussion on internal politics of Venezuela. But I think this is no longer a crisis of Venezuela. This is a crisis for Latin America and specifically for South America, and even with significant repercussions in the US. We have to remember that Venezuelans for several months in the past couple of years have been the #1 nationality with encounters in the southern border over Mexico sometimes. So that gives you a scale of what's going on. In terms of your questions, Steve, how weak is the regime? I think one very important element that I would add to Dorothy's brilliant explanation of what happened with the electoral system on July 28 is the fact that the opposition had access to these tallies because there was collaboration from people within regime structures. So by 6 p.m., we were receiving reports all over the country that there was an order by the regime not to give the opposition witnesses the tallies. And actually, there was Omar Barbosa came out at 7 p.m. saying that the opposition had already 30%, which was actually a very low number for the logistical and the political effort that the opposition was putting to get the 100% of the tallies. And the tallies kept coming, specifically because people from the Plan República, people from CNE, people from witnesses even of the regime were collaborating with the opposition to have the evidence. So I think that sometimes people see the regime as a very cohesive structure, and I think that's the case mostly at the top ranks, but you're already starting to see that at the lower ranks, at the key moment of the election, they already had significant defections. In terms of the way forward, I agree that the challenge that we had ahead of us is how to change the regime's calculation and incentive structure. Specifically, the most difficult part is how to increase the cost of repressing the Venezuelan people, which it's a very difficult one because we've seen that they do it with impunity, right? They go after political activists, they go after people in communities. And what I see and what I hear from community leaders is a lot of fear to even return to their communities to do any sort of political activism because repression has been brutal. So that part, I think it's the trickiest one. Then, of course, there's the how to put more positive incentives on the table, right? And I think, of course, the key challenge is on one hand, the US has a lot of leverage, but as Dorothy was explaining, sanctions relief or offers of sanctions relief are not credible right now, I think, for the regime, because there's an election coming in the US. So depending on what happens on that election, the policy towards Venezuela will be defined in the years to come. But that will be solved in 2 months. So I don't think that should be, something that's not a problem that can't be solved. I think that the big problem is how to overcome the credible commitment problem, right? The credible commitment problem on which the regime would believe that any offer is for real, that the US would really follow through. And I think Maduro, the last element of his narrative, and Chavismo, the last element of the narrative that they have left is the anti-imperialistic, they don't no longer represent the majority of the Venezuelan people, and they know this. So the only thing that they have left to maintain their cohesion is the fear of what would happen if they lose power, and that they are allegedly fighting this war against the empire, the US, right? So that's why I think the role of Brazil and of Latin America is so important. Maduro has always subscribed to the idea of the multipolar world, right? And he has been saying publicly for a long time that he wants to join BRICS. And when you think about a negotiation, a key element is to think about the BATNA, right? What's the alternative that the other party has to a negotiation? And I think Maduro believes that his BATNA is for BRICS to bankroll his authoritarian system. So I think there's a very important work there to be done for Brazil, from Latin American countries, to convince other countries around the world that can be convinced. Of course, there are some like Russia that might be always a spoiler, that without a political solution to the situation in Venezuela, the stability of Latin America will be compromised. So it's not only about democracy, which is, of course, what we care most about, but it's also about stability. Because with the current system, it has been proven over and over again that there's no possibility of economic growth, of the rule of law, and there's no possibility of stability for Venezuela and for the region. So for me, the options are connected to that. I think that to create a good offer for the regime, to have an off-ramp, and to also increase the contradictions within them. And to say, you know, there's a better outcome if you accept the negotiations, so we can start to see pressure from within the regime on the top officials, on Maduro, to accept the negotiation, which is still, I think those dynamics are still not there. But of course, the specifics of that offer and those incentives, positive and negative, I think it's what David is going to speak about. Thank you.
Creating your own segment. Pretty good.
Thanks for setting me up. Okay, all right. Well, you know, I actually was thinking about the original question I was posed, and basically just what happened. And so I'm really going to focus on that. However, in the process, I do think that I will touch on each of Steve's three questions, at least partially. So in thinking about this, you know, it's a heady experience, kind of thinking, you know, it feels like we're in the same place we've always been, or we've been in a long time, but it feels like something's really changed. And so it made me think about this in those terms, you know, what things in this electoral process changed, but not completely. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. So the first configuration that changed, but not completely, in Venezuela's electoral process in the 18 months leading up to July 28, is that Venezuela's hardline opposition robustly embraced electoral politics despite an unfair playing field. While much of the opposition has engaged in electoral politics much of the time during the Maduro period, this hardline opposition had not vigorously embraced it since the legislative elections of 2015. An opposition now unified in its call to the polls and willing to dodge, jump over, and crawl under the Kafkaesque series of obstacles the Maduro government put in its way, generated a tsunami of votes in favor of opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez. The leader of this mobilization was Maria Corina Machado, who only a couple of years earlier had said, "You don't remove dictators with votes." This essentially amounted to an expansion of the realm of politics within the hardline opposition, by which I mean a return to the messy pushes and shoves, consultations and reformulations that balance the ideal with the practical and push forward to the goal. Indeed, the whole opposition was coordinated in this task. Some of the same, for example, some of the same influencers and journalists who in 2021 worked to generate abstention, in 2024 loudly justified and supported the vote. However, this re-engagement of politics did not fully extend to their approach to negotiation. While there was an abstract disposition to negotiate from the top, and there were some agreements within the opposition leadership regarding the guarantees to be offered, these generally had the tone of an executioner's pardon and did not come close to anything that would be attractive to those who control the state apparatus and all of the political and economic benefits this entails. Simple protection from prosecution needed to be accompanied by political and economic assurances to even start a conversation. The broader environment was not fertile either, with journalists and influencers articulated with the campaign continually suggesting that anyone promoting negotiation had ulterior motives. A second noteworthy change that happened but didn't go far enough was that the opposition had a clear plan on how to defend the vote. In 2013, with Maduro winning by a razor-thin margin and in the midst of widespread irregularities, the opposition, led by Enrique Capriles, swung wildly and made demands that either made no sense or were easily deflected by the same powers they were denouncing. In this case, in 2024, anticipating that retaining the vote tally sheets would be the way the government sought to steal the election, something that I didn't I didn't anticipate. They were ready to collect all available tally sheets and post them on a web page, a brilliant move that left little doubt about their victory, as Dorothy has outlined. The space of politics, or at least political strategy, had effectively been expanded. What did not happen was that there seems to have been no clear plan regarding what to do after that. They had expanded the space of politics and mobilization to include releasing the results. However, that was really the limit. Once again, the theory of change seemed to be that righteousness in the face of treachery would lead the walls of Jericho to come tumbling down. Now, that's sort of unfair, because I think none of this should actually be necessary in a democracy, no? But given that we're in an authoritarian context, it seemed like there needed to be another step there. A third notable thing that changed, but not enough, was that the opposition benefited from the mobilization of Venezuela's popular classes in the days after the electoral fraud. The night of the 28th, Machado and Gonzalez did not call on people to take to the streets intentionally, as they did not want to generate a crackdown and had in the works their plan to gather and publish the acts. However, the next people did, primarily from the popular sectors, from the poor barrios in the major cities. This is not without precedent. In January 2019, shortly before Juan Guaido's interim government was created, it was an uprising in the Caracas barrio of Cotiza that revealed widespread discontent with Maduro's inauguration. What did not change was that, as in 2019, this popular mobilization was not publicly engaged by top opposition leadership and was scarcely recognized. Instead, they focused on their base, and Machado held mobilizations in the safe spaces of the eastern part of Caracas. Yes, I do understand that this popular mobilization was not fully spontaneous, and a good part of it came via mobilization by opposition activists in the barrios. And I fully understand the security challenges of mobilizing outside of middle-class opposition spaces in moments like these. But some well-placed rhetoric regarding the protagonism of the popular classes and their heroic leadership could have created an exponentially bigger mobilization. Instead, after a couple of days, the selective repression that is so effective in these circumstances kept people home. A fourth configuration that changed, but not enough, was the criticism from Venezuela's left allies in the region. The first regional leader to criticize the electoral result was Gabriel Boric of Chile. More importantly, 3 of Latin America's biggest democracies, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, still have not recognized the electoral result and have tepidly, although persistently, pushed for a diplomatic solution. Of course, Venezuela has had no problem in the past navigating poor relations with these countries, under Bolsonaro, Duque, and Peña Nieto. But I think it's different to have poor relations with left-leaning countries. What has not changed, however, is the ineffectiveness of these efforts in the case of Venezuela. I think this is still the most interesting space for innovation in the current context, but so far has not fulfilled its potential. The final thing that changed, but not completely, was that the Maduro government seriously misplayed its political hand. After almost a decade of keeping the opposition off balance and disunified, the Maduro government headed straight into a historic electoral defeat. In the months prior, as the government hurtled toward a historic electoral loss, speculating on what they were thinking became a cottage industry, which I was actively part of. Were they going to cancel Edmundo Gonzalez's candidacy at the last minute? Were they going to postpone the elections? Were they going to invade Guyana? Did they perhaps have better information than pollsters on the structure of the population, such that they knew that they could outperform the polls? All of these hypotheses were wrong. The Maduro government did, in fact, drive straight off a cliff, only developing a plan B shortly before the election, which, of course, was poorly executed. In this electoral process, they were caught in the classic dictator's dilemma, in which the information received and processed by an authoritarian government is poor because everyone is afraid to say the truth that everyone knows is true. Not only did they underestimate opposition mobilization, they missed the growing spirit of non-compliance in their own coalition. On July 28, the Chavista machine no longer functioned during the election as it did before. The 1-by-10 electoral mobilization scheme did not work as planned. In many places, the puntos rojos, these are the places where people are supposed to register their vote, and which, in this context, in which a lot of people don't believe, aren't sure about the secrecy of the vote, works to inhibit the people's vote. were not installed or were ineffective. The same goes for the demand that public employees take pictures of themselves voting. The numbers would suggest that there were people mobilized by Chavismo that did not vote for Maduro, most opting for El Mundo, something that, to my knowledge, had not happened widely before. What did not change is that this did not lead to a transition, but to an immediate crackdown internally and externally. The Maduro government quickly regained its focus under the pressure of survival and cracked down. Indeed, there were no significant defections. Through this electoral process, the Maduro government has moved from being hegemonic power based on coercion and consent to a dictatorship simply based on coercion alone. In the aftermath of the election, many who were effectively defecting paid the price, with firings and even arrests of those who had not collaborated with the regime or had collaborated with the opposition. This, combined with selective repression, has put Maduro government in control again. However, we are, as Roberto suggested, in a new stage. There are Chavistas I have known for decades who, for the first time, in my experience with them, for the first time ever, have said that these people are dictators and have to go. This is clearly not the place that the Maduro coalition wanted to be in. They went to elections and risked it all because they strongly desired the legitimacy that could lead to normalization. They got just the opposite. They are a pariah state in a permanent state of exception. But with Western democracies exhausted by Venezuela and skeptical of the effectiveness of sanctions and interim governments, and with solid alliances with global autocracies, the odds of success are clearly in Maduro's favor, I'm sorry to say. What is to be done is not clear, but the considerable achievements of the opposition over the past year have come through the expansion of politics, in signing the Barbados Accords, in going to a primary and unifying behind the primary winner, in selecting 2 substitute candidates and going to elections. The setbacks have been in spaces where politics were not given precedence, such as negotiations before and after the election, a plan after proving the fraud, and a plan for engaging the popular sectors at a key moment of mobilization. Of course, in a democracy, none of this should actually be necessary, I should say again. So this is not a condemnation of negligence. It's more like sort of a halftime talk, reviewing what worked and what didn't as the struggle continues. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We randomly selected the name of the person who would get to ask the first question, and I won. I'm gonna ask the first question. And then we'll probably take a group of questions, and you guys should feel free to answer just the questions that you want. Don't feel like you have to go through every one. Two pretty narrow questions. First of all, I think this is crucial. Was the decision not to call for an uprising on the night of the 28th a mistake? The second question is about Lula. I was in August. I was in Brazil in August, and everybody I talked to remotely related to the Brazilian government or establishment, I asked them, what the hell is the Lula government doing? Got all kinds of responses. There were a minority who said, no, they know what they're doing. They just want to have a seat at the table. They know what they're doing. But most people in the Brazilian establishment ended up telling me they have no flipping idea what they're doing. And my question to you is not what they're doing. What could Lula do? What is the optimal strategy that the Brazilian government could follow? So let me ask those two, and then I will now chop. We can go in. Why don't we go in the? You want to start, Dorothy?
No, let's let David start.
You're getting set up, man.
Yeah, I didn't know that was an option. She has the right to point to me.
Apparently.
It's because she came in person, David.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess so. That's I would have, no, but this was the invitation. I think the first question is a really good one. I was a little surprised when they so sort of clearly called for, people to not go out in the streets. And on the one hand, I thought, strategically that would be a good idea. And also there had been so much criticism of the previous decade over Enrique Capriles doing that I was really quite surprised by that. But I thought that was actually quite interesting thing to do that I thought got everybody a little bit off balance, and they were clearly busy, putting together a strategy of demonstrating this fraud. So I thought it was really quite good. I thought, it was a real missed opportunity to not have sort of rhetorically engaged all the uprising that were going on. I mean, the next day there were all these videos on TikTok and Twitter and of these uprisings and mobilizations, and I know some of these were organized by political parties themselves and whatnot, but there were also just massive random people coming down from Petare. Just it was really just a wave of people, and of that moment she had said, we didn't call people out in the streets, but this is the people's victory. We're seeing that the popular sectors are with us and they're the ones that bring Venezuela forward. Some kind of political rhetoric with that I think could have really just overwhelmed, but she didn't even mention it. No, and I think it wasn't mentioned in any of the sort of official opposition discourse. I know there were lower level opposition people that were talking about this, but not the ones that were really at the top of the campaign. And so I think that was a real strategic mistake, and I think there's all kinds of historical reasons and sort of that we can get into of how popular classes are not seen as actors and oftentimes in Venezuela and Latin America. So that I think was a big mistake after a pretty good start. So what can Lula do? I mean, it's important to not overestimate the international context. And I think a paper that I am writing with a student, and we sort of published a version. A student, Rowan Scarpino, a former student of mine, we published in Foreign Policy last February, basically showing that nothing that the United States had done over the Maduro period had any noticeable impact on Maduro. It was basically what Maduro does, and whether it's relative liberalization or relative authoritarian crackdown depends on whether the opposition is in position to take power. And so I think it's good not to overestimate that. But this is the most dynamic and interesting place. I mean, I think if these three would get together and come up with a unified stance and saying, you need to show this. No, we're not going to recognize you, unless you show these acts, or something else has to be done, and in a much more assertive way, I think that could have an impact. But they've just barely been able to work together and come out with some now strong, now mealy mouth, dispersed statements that have not really done much. I mean, so I don't want to overestimate what it could be done, but I think they could do much more in a coordinated way than they've done so far.
Roberto, was it a mistake?
Sure. So I agree with David that it's difficult to call it a mistake.
Call it a mistake.
Yeah, it's hard because, of course, in the past we've had demonstrations, and we've seen after the fact, after the day, that the repression was really brutal, right? So we cannot predict whether that would have generated change or would have just generated more victims. It's difficult really to predict. This is a regime that made the decision that day that they were going to stay regardless of the cost, right? So I think it's difficult for me to call it a mistake. Of course, it was surprising, as David is saying, the response, the spontaneous response of many people in the popular sectors. And I think it was an opportunity, and it was a gamble, to say, well, let's go all in with a demonstration and say we go again in the confrontation in the streets, or the strategy of what was done of trying to consolidate the proofs and then try to make the case without increasing the cost for the people. So it's very difficult to say if being the analyzing after what happened. Of course, you can now see, well, so far the strategy has not worked because we haven't had change yet. So maybe that opens up the debate on whether that would have generated a different outcome, but it's not a certainty either. With respect to your question on Lula, I think Lula should prioritize this and should himself get involved. That's the first thing. I think he's been trying to delegate on Celso Amorim, and he's trying to put some distance from it and try to, for many years, Lula had tried to downplay the importance of Venezuela and saying, you know, the US and all the countries in the world, you know, when there's a war in Ukraine and the Middle East and so on, and they are concerned about Venezuela, you know, like trying to say it doesn't matter. And I think that's the mistake that they should avoid, the Brazilians. It does matter, and it should be their priority, because we are their neighbors, and this is a crisis for South America, for Latin America, and it's the one crisis on which they could have an impact. They've tried to play a role in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and they failed. So the one thing that Lula could do internationally that makes that could have an impact and make sense is with respect to Venezuela. That's the one thing. Then what to do about it? I think they should engage with Maduro and his elite privately, but also publicly. One of my concerns is that there's been reports that the US, for example, has offered off-ramps to the Maduro elite. My question is how much people within the regime actually know that this is on the table? Because it's a very secretive structure, right? And it's Maduro and his closest collaborators who have these channels of communication. And we need the coalition of the regime to actually come to terms with the idea of the negotiation. So, and that can be by a consensus, or that can be because different parts of factions within the regime start pressuring Maduro to accept a negotiation. So that offer, I think Lula should help make it public and also privately try to give reassurances to them. And my final point is something that I already spoke a little bit at the beginning, which is this more global role that Lula could play. I think Lula is probably the gatekeeper of BRICS in Latin America, and he should speak to his founding partners of BRICS and say, we cannot accept Venezuela if they continue to be a source of instability for South America. So he should put pressure also on that. And so Maduro understands that there's no way out for him, that there's no alternative, that there's not a different part of the world that he can just ignore whatever Latin America and the US and Europe says, and he can just go along with India and China and Russia, which, by the way, I don't think the signal so far hasn't been that they're willing to bankroll Maduro either. So, but I think Lula should help make that very clear.
Very quickly. So I think on this question of, was it a mistake not to call for mobilization on the night of the 28th? Whenever we're asking, was it a mistake, we have to specify, has it been revealed to be a mistake ex post, or was it a mistake ex ante? And that's the point I was making about Maduro going to this election. Has it been revealed to have been a mistake for him ex post? Yes. Was it obviously a mistake ex ante? Much less clear. And I think the same is true of this decision. Maybe David is right. It was a mistake. It's been revealed to have been a mistake ex post, but ex ante, I think it was completely reasonable to say, if we call for mobilization before we show proof of our victory, then people will accuse us of doing what the opposition has done many times, which is cry fraud without proof. And so I think ex ante, we could see how that's a reasonable decision. Now, what could Lula do? Could be a long list, but I just want to say one thing. Recognize Gonzalez's victory. Lula has not recognized Gonzalez's victory, and I think the campaign has provided sufficient evidence to justify that.
Okay, start with you.
Hi, just a couple of things. I think here in the US, we tend to underestimate the degree of opposition to US imperialism. That is a trump that, sorry to use the term, that is a trump that Maduro and his regime have used ever since Chavez. It's not a small deal. It's a very big deal when the Americans are on the other side. We are condescending to ourselves. They are not. The second thing that these really excellent, all of you speakers have talked about is, I think you've omitted only one thing, and that is Venezuela's excellent state security, which has an etymology to East Germany, where Putin made his bones, transferred to Havana, where the Cuban regime has survived and survived often on the backs of state security. And state security is very, very important in Venezuela to this day. And so one could come to the conclusion that Maduro miscalculated about the regime, but he had these two aces. One, anti-imperialism. The Americans are going to lecture people on human rights, considering what America's allies are doing around the world. Far more people are in jail who are America's allies than Maduro has put in jail. And Maduro's repression is horrible. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's a good thing. On the contrary, I believe in democracy, but it's effective. And so what we're seeing, I think, is the result of serious miscalculation of the Maduro regime about the degree of Venezuelan opposition's organization. But they have not forgotten, nor have they ceased to avail themselves of their anti-imperialist trump and their ability to rely on state security just to stay in power.
Thanks, Bjorn. We have a lot of people asking questions, so I have to try to keep them as concise as possible.
Okay, I will try. This was great. Thanks, everyone. Two very good questions. Number one, what do we think the Venezuelan opposition will do moving forward? In particular, along these sort of two questions that have divided it for so long, right? One is whether to continue competing electorally or go more maximalist, and another is whether they're able to kind of do whatever they do together, or whether they split up. So not what should the opposition do, but what do you think they will do, and why? Stop there, and if there's time, I'm gonna bug you again to let me ask another question.
We'll never get back to you again. If you have a second question, I would.
Sure, okay. Let me try to be as brief as I can. I also love the idea of pacted transitions, and I love O'Donnell and Schmitter as much as anyone. But one sort of key assumption of pacted transitions is that regime actors, in particular softliners, believe that over a sufficiently long period of time, a transition to democracy or an opening of the regime is inevitable, right? This is sort of a precondition because then people decide, okay, I'd rather take an exit option now than wait until I leave through the back door or go to prison. Okay, so my question is, for Venezuelan regime insiders, what did this election reveal about the long-term viability of the regime? Because you can imagine both readings. One reading is, look, this is about as bad a crisis as this regime could have expected, and it survived. In other words, we can play this game until we all die. And the other interpretation is, look, miscalculation, broad public opposition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe this isn't going to be around for as long as I think. So which of those two worlds is closest to what actually happened?
Couple more. Carla and then June.
Okay, so thank you for your amazing presentations. So two quick questions. Going back to Dorothy's point, and I think Roberto said something about this, but the idea that the opposition would have access to such a massive amount of information, the tally sheets that you, Dorothy, were talking about, does that mean that there was clear compliance from the military? And can you zoom in into that? Because I think that Roberto said, well, I mean, clearly there were actors, key actors from the system, but which actors are those? And whether you can say something in particular about certain individuals, certain brokers. I'm thinking Diosdado Cabello or Leslie Rodriguez. Are they key actors in any ways for the negotiation, for good or for bad? And the second question was going back to that, whether the transition literature of the 80s is still relevant today. Are there any idiosyncrasies or specificities, historical and regional, that would make that literature not as relevant for understanding the negotiations today?
June?
Yeah. I want to ask about two actors that haven't been brought up yet. And one, building on Dorothy's comments about the immense amount of information that's out there, what has been the role of journalism, particularly within Venezuela? And secondly, what is the role, or what could be the role of the Venezuelan diaspora, particularly within Latin America itself?
Thanks. We'll now go back to our speakers. obviously do not have to answer all the questions if you take 2 or 3 minutes and answer a few.
Okay,
Dorothy?
great. Yeah, amazing questions. Thank you. So let me start with this question about what will the opposition do? And I'm not in the forecasting business, but I can think about, there are 2 ways, I think, for the opposition to interpret what happened, right? One interpretation is we had the maximally positive electoral result and there's been no transition, therefore we go maximalist and there's no point in competing in the regional elections next year, for example. But I think for me, there's a different takeaway, which is the value of maintaining these partial spaces, even in the absence of a level playing field, right? So why did they have the QR code? So these tally sheets have at the bottom a QR code that was essential to getting this information together so quickly, because you can scan that QR code with your phone and it spits out the data that populates the spreadsheet. Because there was an opposition member of the Electoral Council 5 years ago who proposed that and implemented that when he was on the Electoral Council. And so I think that, shows the value of having these partial spaces, participating in regional elections. And so that's one possible takeaway. And the only other thing I'll say is, this question about the military is obviously essential. And I've been thinking over the past few days about, a counterfactual trajectory here in which we had a once improving relationship with Cuba, this going back before 2016, and a trajectory in which we had been able to use that once improving relationship with Cuba to then have more answers to these questions about what's going on inside the fund. And obviously that didn't happen, but that could have been a very different world.
Roberto.
Sure. Thank you for the questions. So I will bundle the first 2. I agree that the state security apparatus is probably the key actor right now within the regime. And I think in terms of the strategy of the opposition, I've been pretty much on the camp of people who believe that we need to participate, that we need to win the hearts and minds of Venezuelan people, that we need to go to the popular sectors. I've devoted my career to that. That being said, I have serious doubts looking into the future because I think, as I was saying, we had on July 28 a turning point, a watershed moment in a way. It's going to be very difficult after what happened on July 28 to convince people that actually voting makes any sense. Because people say, well, in July 28, we won by a margin of 2-1. So now, why would I risk? People would say, people who voted, people who were witnesses had been imprisoned. Why would we risk that again if we know that on the crucial election, which was a presidential one, this was the outcome? So for the opposition, and this is very my own personal view, to consider that it's a strategy in the future, it needs to be as a result of a negotiation. I don't see in the current environment the possibility of going back to let's just run for the regional elections and that's it. I don't think it's going to be a very easy sell. I don't think so. It's going to be very hard. That being said, the key element for me, one of the before the election, a lot of people would dismiss Maduro and would say Maduro is just an idiot, nobody respects him, and so on. I was part of the negotiation team. I was the technical coordinator of the negotiation team when the Barbados negotiations in 2019. And I have to say that one of the lessons that I took after coming there is that it was clear to me that Maduro was pretty much the boss of the regime. Everyone there recognized and saw him, and the signals were clear that he was in charge. And he was probably in charge of what, and the narrative that they would say is that Maduro had overcame the challenge of the protests in 2017 with the Constituyente. Was a gamble that Maduro did. And that really generated respect among the other factions of Chavismo, that he was finally the leader that they needed to recognize after what, happened in the elections in 2013, where he, had a very contested election after Chavez a couple months before had won by a significant margin. But I think Maduro in July 28, he lost that. I think everybody knows within the regime that he lost the election. And now he depends not on his leadership, but rather on the state security apparatus to sustain his position. And we have to understand that this is a shrinking economy and cake that they want to distribute among them. And if you don't have one person who everyone respects and an authority figure, I think that's very prime for instability. And that's where I think a lot of the incentives to push for a negotiation within their own regime could come from. So I would, those are my reflections in terms of the opposition strategy and how to think about incentivizing that as well, incentivizing the divisions within the regime that allow and push for a negotiation. Finally, with respect to journalists and diaspora, I think journalists have been really important in the struggle for democracy in Venezuela. You have one that I respect a lot in the room, Boris Munoz. And I think him and his colleagues have made a very significant effort of putting the voice of the Venezuelan people out, despite very harsh repression as well against them. And with respect to the diaspora, I think it's hard. Your question was specifically about the diaspora in Latin America. The diaspora that it's living in Latin America is in very dire economic situation. So it's very difficult, and they're trying to adapt, trying to get by. In Colombia, which we have to recognize that all Latin American countries have not recovered economically since the pandemic. So a lot of people are thinking about migrating again. I mentioned we did a poll, and there's over 500,000 Venezuelans in the Americas who are considering migrating to the US now, of those who already left Venezuela. So I think it's going to be hard for them to prioritize doing politics within the countries in which they are. That being said, I think it's of course an opportunity to engage and try to mobilize that diaspora.
David?
Thank you. Okay, I won't take all the questions, but to the first questions, I mean, I totally agree with state security. Maduro's comprehensive control of a very effective state security apparatus is absolutely key. And not just that, but if you look at it, the control over basically every institution of the national government, as well as the armed forces, as well as a state oil company, is one of the things that makes this a very different context than, say, Guatemala and Bernardo Arevalo, and who was able to struggle and end up prevailing. It's closer to Nicaragua in that sense. In that this comprehensive control really is just made it difficult for this resounding electoral victory to actually have a result. In terms of U.S. reputation, sort of the U.S. anti-imperialism or anti-imperialism towards the U.S. being key in all this, and I think that's key in the long-term arc of things. No, I think in the current context with these elections, as I don't see anybody really talking about that. No, and I think this is the point of all the past. No, that I just haven't heard some of the Chavistas that I know saying, "Oh, the U.S. is behind this," or I mean, of course, Diosdado says this, but that this is just imperialism from the U.S. and Europe. People I think have kind of in this case have seen through that, and that has not been a big factor now, even though I think it is a big factor over the whole arc of the period of Chavismo. I'm not going to go into what the opposition is factually going to do. I will say what I think it should do, and that is that I think, as my presentation suggested, they should keep engaging in politics. I mean, I think they should participate in the elections that are coming into 2025. I mean, I think of those elections, they're like, oh, how can you participate in something that, it's just so stolen this way? But, the goal can't just be to win the election and take power. You've got to make the adversary play, make him play. I think in this case it's shown that, even though the government is still in control, it's in a worse situation than it was before. The opposition actually gained from this. As far as sort of the long-term viability of the regime, this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. What does it mean, to to govern not as a hegemony that, you know, through coercion and consent, but rather just through coercion. And I had some kind of, you know, optimism, or I've been thinking about that. And I was talking with Dora Telles, who I think is probably in the room, you know, about Nicaragua, and you know, and she, you know, basically said that no, Ortega has been able to keep, you know, through comprehensive control of the state, and, you know, alliances with business, you know, and through sort of this selective terror, has been able to keep a lid on things, and might be able to, even though, you know, I had been kind of thinking, well, there's no longer have control over the state, maybe this is just all going to fall apart. And she just said, well, Nicaragua, basically, you know, things aren't working very well. The state's not fulfilling its functions, but people have nothing, you know, can't really protest about that because it's kind of a terror regime. And so I think that, you know, I don't necessarily think that, you know, Maduro being caught with his pants down and being exposed to everybody, you know, necessarily means that this regime is unstable, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of sort of compliance, that is a really interesting thing, but it's actually a little bit easier than the person who asked the question, you know, about these QR codes and the voter tallies. I mean, the way this works, you know, every witness is supposed to get a vote tally. You know, and this fraud, my understanding of this fraud was so sort of last minute and poorly executed that many people actually did get their voter tallies. At least some members of some parties got the vote tallies, and I think pretty much all of the PSUV, the Socialist Party members, got voter tallies. And so what the opposition was able to do is collect. All you need is one of these people. You only needed one leak from each electoral table to have that voter tally, because it's valid for the whole electoral table. And leaks there were, because it's hard to express, you know, when you think about sort of how cynical this regime can be, how sincere Venezuelans and even Venezuela, and especially I think Venezuelans close to the government are about this. One of the reasons I never imagined that they would do this, like try to retain the voter tallies, is that that's such an ingrained thing that Chavismo has developed over two decades, that this is our electoral system and it is auditable through citizen audit. I mean, it's an ideological thing. And so there were people that I know personally, I wasn't told about it. I heard about it, that were aghast at this, that were aghast that they were being told to not share the voter tallies, and that on purpose, shared voter tallies, because that was just like, that just took them aback, and this is why in the days afterwards, when this repression happened, when the repression started, a lot of the first target of the state security apparatus, the repression, was a lot of Chavista community leaders that had been witnesses at tables, people that they suspected could be the people that were sharing these voter tallies, and so this was, I think, a big issue, and this is why I say that they on the 28th and for a couple of days afterwards, they lost control. They didn't understand the dissatisfaction that was bubbling up within their coalition. As far as the transition literature of the 1980s, now I have gone through the cycle and I think, that was a different period, those are like right wing, and this is totally different. And I remember reading John Keane, on the Do Despotism. I was like, yeah, this is it. Yeah. And I was going to write a paper, and say, this is a new kind of despotism and whatever. And so I said, well, I'm just go back to Juan Lintz's, original essay on authoritarianism. And I went back there and it was like, all of this was basically there. I mean, all of this, selective repression, how to divide and conquer, how to use information, all of these things were there in the sort of original portrait of authoritarianism. And I think in the paper I was writing, I put John Keane in like a footnote because I just ended up using Juan Lintz's stuff because it was still entirely relevant, And if you look at it, the thing is, it's really actually quite abstract, It's usually about it's not like concrete mechanisms that authoritarians use to stay in power and what opposition should do, but it's much more sort of almost like a philosophy of change, of keeping up dynamism and keeping up sort of, keeping, answering power, I mean, getting it off balance. And so it's really surprising if you go back to Juan Linz, if you go to Linz and Steppen, you go to the Green Book and read it, and it's I think it's entirely relevant still, actually. Of course, they didn't have anything about social media, and there's some things that change with that in populism, I think. But in general, I think 90% of it is still quite relevant. Finally, about journalism, I'm just going to make a couple of comments without anything to really tie it together. I mean, I think it's an interesting situation that any assessment of Venezuela has to bring into account. On the one hand, the Venezuelan journalism outstanding, and I'm not saying that it's just like lingering from 30 years ago. I think in the past 10 years, we've had a really sort of explosive, important growth of sort of digital platforms that, and I think with the critique of the previous period of media that was so polarized and whatnot, we had this the growth of these independent digital media platforms that are really doing high quality journalism and really are not involved in the polarization and are just really doing fantastic work. That's great. The problem is that within Venezuela, most people don't have access to these, because a lot of them are blocked by the regime, and people don't know or understand how to use VPN, or VPN is just too difficult for their limited technology, or fewer and fewer people have actually smartphones. And so there's this mismatch with the quality of information with the quality of what people are actually getting there. So that's sort of the state of affairs. What's really interesting, though, is that none of this impeded this avalanche, this tsunami of votes for Maria Corina and Mundo, really. And I think, a lot of that, ended up coming from, all the events they did. They just incessantly did events across the country and word of mouth. And so the media context, it's great potential. It's kind of bleak, but I think something else is kind of going on that I'm not exactly sure what it was that happened, but clearly, despite the impoverished media context for people, they came out and voted.
Okay, I'm going to extend it to 1:25. We're running out of time. We have 5 or 6 minutes left, and we got a bunch of great questions online. So I want to very quickly shoot 2 online questions / comments and ask you to take literally a minute each to respond. So Francisco Modaldi doesn't see what incentive Maduro has to negotiate. He said he's survived through everything. He survived the worst: sanctions, isolation, economic catastrophe. He's got control of the military. His question is, what is he missing? What could possibly induce Maduro to negotiate? I know it's a big question, but that's only 30 seconds. Thank you. The other question is from Fernando Bizarro, who gave us a great short question, which is, who is profiting from the current status quo of this sort of uncertainty? The regime is discredited, isolated, it's very uncertain, prolonged transition. Who benefits every day as time passes?
I have 30 seconds.
And Alicia can have 30 seconds.
Dorothy, will Maduro change the voting system in 2025, or is this ingrained in Venezuelan culture and he can't change it? And second, we've made the hardliners sound like they are ideological anti-imperialists, but are they simply in control of the drug trade and regulated industries in ways that the US and international players cannot give them an economic off-ramp?
So that's 4 questions and 1 minute each. Start with Dorothy.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just be very selective. First of all, this has been such an amazing discussion. Thanks everyone for being here. In 2019, January 2019, at the peak of the Guaido excitement and, frenzy, I wrote this article that the first line was, Nicolas Maduro has a knack for surviving prophecies of his demise. And at that point, he had already, to Monaldi's point, survived, many protests and recall attempts, and now even more so. And so I guess, I would, in answering Francisco's question, just come back to a general principle that served me well now for nearly 20 years thinking about Venezuelan politics, which is Francisco Monaldi is right. I mean, it's always a good good guiding principle to come back to. I'll just leave it there. I know we're at
Roberto.
I like that principle too. So I think just to make a comment, I think on that, I think Maduro's position is worse now than it was on July 27th. So what is he missing? He's now missing the solidarity of his allies in the region. He's missing any legitimacy in terms internal legitimacy. So I think, of course, Maduro and his people would want to normalize their situation. So I think, as Francisco is putting well, it's difficult. There's not much room to maneuver, but I think there's still some levers to be used to try to incentivize them positively, and also try to increase the pressure on the people who are repressing the Venezuelan people and are making the decisions in the regime. In terms of who profits, the first thing that came to mind is irregular and organized crime, irregular groups. I was thinking of the groups who are enabling the crossing in the Darien Gap, for example. They're making massive amounts of money out of the Venezuelan migrants who are in a desperate situation. So I would think that the ones who are still controlling the illegal mining, for example, are profiting, and the people from the regime that keep living very luxurious lives in Caracas and in Venezuela, despite the terrible crisis that it's happening in the country. I'll leave it there.
David, you have the final word.
Okay, so quickly, I think, I follow the friend Monaldi's right dictum myself frequently. I think Maduro right now has no incentive to negotiate or do anything to leave power. That doesn't mean he never will. I mean, I think it would have to be a situation in which he is really worried about his survival, worried about or thinks that this is not gonna, this is gonna come to an end. Right now, that hasn't happened. No, they just took a big blow with its election. If there had been a much more coordinated international response, if there had been, a much more significant uprising, within Venezuela that the security forces were not, hesitated to repress, well, that could have, put it in a different situation. But right now, I don't think he has much incentive. So the question of who's profiting with the sort of the delays of what's going on and how slow this process is working out now, clearly Maduro, and Maduro is kicking the can down the road, basically with, the Tres Amigos with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. They've tried to meet with him a couple of times. Each time he has some kind of, other commitment or whatever. And so I think clearly the longer things go and the more they get normalized, the better position he's in. I think that was what your question was. I think also Russia, China, and Iran, I think also benefit from this, and having Venezuela in their corner as another autocracy. I think, and for Alicia's question, I think it's both, and I think one of the things that is growing, with my friend, Desmond Arias, for example, is looking at sort of illicit trade, illicit violent groups, non-state violent groups, and how much ideology they have, and trying to figure out why the ideology still is part of what they do. Why bother with that? And so I do think that this, their ideology, their anti-imperialist, socialist, Chavista ideology is an important sort of glue. It's a way of communicating with each other, but clearly below that are a lot of interests. And I think it's not really necessarily drugs. I think the drugs are part of it, but I think it's a small part. It's economic interest, because they control the ports, the importation of food, importation of security equipment, importation of basic everything. So the huge economic interests. And I think drugs is only a small part of that, but I do think that economic interests have everything to do with this, and are one big thing that have to be taken into account in any effort to try and relaunch negotiations.
Thanks. Before I close, let me just invite you to join us next week for a great panel on why the political center can't win elections anymore in Latin America. That will feature our own Claudia Lopez, among others. Couldn't, right. Up to the present moment, be able to win elections anymore. That said, many thanks to Dorothy Kronick, to David Smilde, and to Roberto Patiño for a fabulous conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.